Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. Today is another LOdown with Lo, a solo episode where we will be talking about why some of the common acne medications that are used, like Accutane and retinols and oral contraceptives like birth control and spironolactone work, and what you should know about what can also be done to mimic how they work through nutritional strategies. We'll talk about some of the mechanisms of how these medications work and how it closely parallels some of the nutritional things that we can do as well, and how you can understand how to really heal your acne from the root cause so that not only are you going to see improvements to your skin while you're making these changes, but that you will see improvements to your skin and overall health and well-being much longer than even just the time period it takes you to be able to heal your skin. Remember that acne is a symptom. It's a symptom of imbalance in the body. So when we can really identify why that acne is happening internally, we can start to actually heal from within. And when we heal from within, that's where we really see lifelong change happening within how our body functions. So let's get into today's episode. And I want to start off and talk about some of these common medications that we see a lot of clients that come to work with us have been on, are currently on, or maybe have even considered utilizing because they're really at their wits' end with their acne and really are just trying to find something that works. So the first one that I would say has really grown in popularity is spironolactone. And spironolactone actually was not made for acne. It's used off-label for acne. And it is something that it's a drug that can be kind of used as like a secondary line of defense for those that maybe don't want to go on birth control or have had potential issues with birth control in the past. And the way that it works is actually in two different ways. The first way that it works is that it blocks androgens, which are those male-like hormones like testosterone and DHEA. It blocks them at both your hair follicle and your sebaceous gland, which is your skin. And this is also one of the reasons why it can be utilized for androgenic alopecia, which is hair loss because of high androgens. It also reduces the release or secretion of androgens from the adrenal gland. So not only is it working like at the site of where these androgens are the issue, but it's also decreasing the amount of these androgens that are released from the adrenals. The adrenals are these two little glands that are located on top of our kidneys, and they're responsible for a significant amount of our total androgen production. Testosterone doesn't just come from the ovaries, it also comes from the adrenals, but the adrenals also make other androgens outside of testosterone, things like DHEA, DHEAS, androstenedione. And for a lot of women that have elevated androgens, they generally have a significant amount of their androgens coming from the adrenal glands. So these are two of the ways that it works. And what I see is that a lot of women are told that spironolactone is a safer option because it's not going to completely shut off your hormones and it's not going to impede your cycle, your menstrual cycle, like birth control would. But that's actually not the case. And I would say that most of the women that we've worked with in practice, they have had menstrual irregularities happen when they've been on spironolactone. They either have had complete cessation of their period and are not menstruating at all. They have very low hormone outputs, or their cycles are very irregular. They're not ovulating. Their cycles are very short. And this is because of that blocking that happens of these androgens. That's part of it. And these androgens are what testosterone in particular converts over to estrogen for us to make adequate estradiol. So that's not necessarily the case. We do see that there are cycle changes that happen with spironolactone. And it's also important to note that not everyone makes this really androgenic form of these androgens. So testosterone is one of the most common androgens that we refer to, that most people know about. And we actually make more testosterone, more androgens in total than any other hormone in the body, even as women. Yes. So it's just that we still make a lot less than men, about 1/10. But about 10% of that testosterone that's made gets converted over to a hormonal metabolite called DHT, or dihydrotestosterone. And DHT is about 3 times more potent than testosterone. So when we've got a lot of testosterone converting over to DHT, even if you don't make a lot of testosterone, that testosterone is very powerful and it's going to cause more symptoms like things such as acne, hair loss on the head, weight gain in the abdominal region, irregular cycles, and so forth. And we can actually look at this information. We can see what are your testosterone levels, your total testosterone, your free testosterone levels, and then what are your DHT levels, and are you someone that is converting more of this testosterone over to DHT? And this is actually what causes those symptoms in women. It's also what causes male pattern baldness in men as well. So this DHT hormone is something that both men and women have. And this process happens in the testes and prostates in men. In women, this process mainly happens in the ovaries, but a little bit of it happens in the skin and other parts of the body, such as the liver and such. So this process of testosterone converting over to DHT really is systemic in terms of how it's happening in the body. And there's a couple of things that we know influence this conversion. Genetics can be one piece. Some people genetically, they're more prone to this conversion happening. However, we also know that insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation play a significant role in DHT production. And so with insulin resistance, that means that you're resistant to the hormone insulin. So what should happen after you eat carbohydrate is that hormone insulin should get released, and that the job of insulin is to take that sugar and bring it into the cells that need it. And when we are resistant to insulin, that process doesn't happen. That sugar doesn't get taken into those cells. It just stays in the bloodstream. And essentially, we need to resensitize our body's ability to respond to this insulin. So it's not just reduce carbohydrate or improve blood sugar. It goes so much further than that, because even if you reduce carbohydrate in your diet, sometimes that's not the right decision to make, because we know that carbohydrate is really important for the reproductive system and thyroid hormones and such. But it also can be problematic because you're not actually correcting the core issue, which isn't the carbohydrates. It's the inability to take those carbohydrates and bring them into the cells. And that takes a little bit of some deeper digging and support to be able to make that process happen. There's also natural androgen blockers that can help to be able to lower DHT. You might have heard of things like spearmint tea and saw palmetto, white peony. These are some herbal type options that can be utilized to be able to support this process. Generally, there's brands that do sell these, and they're used in a lot of like hair loss supplements. Like Nutrafol is a common hair loss supplement. I know that there's saw palmetto. I don't think there's spearmint in there, but I know there's saw palmetto and a lot of other acne type clearing support. However, sometimes I find that they're not in quite therapeutic dosages, so they're not quite elevated enough. Or there's more needle moving type measures that we can make within diet and exercise and things that can help with this insulin sensitivity, with improving insulin sensitivity, that are going to really make a greater impact on this DHT. So we've seen in practice that women that have been on spironolactone, that we've implemented some of our nutritional support to be able to support this process with them for 4-6 weeks. Their skin has started to clear. They've started to feel more confident to come off the spironolactone. They've been able to come off the spironolactone and been able to maintain the results without it in the mix. So that is one thing to know about this. And I think it's really important to shed light on the fact that it can impact the menstrual cycle, because I don't think that that's talked about enough. Now, on the other end of the spectrum are oral contraceptives or birth control. Generally for acne, oral contraceptives are utilized because hormonally they're a little bit different than something like an IUD. IUDs, they contain progestin, and molecularly it looks more similar to testosterone. So a lot of times with IUDs, you can actually see acne present because of the IUD. But with oral contraceptives, they tend to be very skin clearing. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that they suppress the amount of those androgens that are made in the ovaries. They also suppress the amount of estrogen and really all of your sex hormones that are made, so that communication between our brain and our ovaries gets shut off. And so that puts us into a very low hormone state. So we're not making very many hormones. And they also increase the production of something called sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG. This hormone or this protein, it binds up hormones, sex hormones in particular, just as the name implies. So what happens is, say you make 100 grams, this is not how you measure testosterone, but say you make 100 grams of testosterone and you've got 30 grams of sex hormone binding globulin. That means you have 70 grams of testosterone that's free and available to start causing acne and all these androgen excess symptoms. But if SHBG increases from 30 up to 80, now you've only got 20 grams of testosterone that can cause acne and androgenic symptoms. So you see that even if the hormones don't change, the amount that's available for the body to utilize is changing significantly. However, birth control tends to do both. It tends to suppress the amount of hormones and it tends to increase the binding of these hormones. And that's why so many women that are on birth control experience low libido, low energy, difficulty gaining muscle mass, because they're in a very low testosterone state. And you need testosterone for all of those facets I just mentioned. So it's very effective for reducing these testosterone levels and increasing SHBG. However, the problem with oral contraceptives, and if you've ever been on one, you've probably experienced this, that when you come off of them, something called an androgen rebound often happens. And I like to think of it as like all of these androgens are being closed behind a door. And then when you take the birth control out of the picture, that door gets open and all of these androgens kind of come, like, flooding out of the room that they were in, right? And so they become free and available because there's no longer that SHBG there in quite the quantities that it once was. So there's a lot of things that we can do prior to coming off birth control to actually put your body in a better position so that that androgen rebound doesn't happen. So if you are thinking about coming off birth control and you know that acne was an issue for you before you went off of it, I would highly recommend supporting your body to prevent that androgen rebound. If you've already come off birth control and now you're starting to see those acne symptoms represent again, then we kind of have to go back to identifying and addressing the root cause of what's elevating these androgens and why you're making so many of these androgens. With birth control, it's very much, and with all of these measures, right, they're Band-Aids. So they're very effective, but a lot of the symptoms, 99% generally, of the symptoms you had prior to going on it, you're going to be presented with when you come off of it. It doesn't fix anything. It actually can worsen a lot of things while you're on it, right? So you're not actually going to see any improvements happen. And it's not something you really should be on for that long of a period of your lifespan. And so that's why when you come off of it, you're represented with all the things that were never addressed in the first place. And I just wish that young girls were educated on this, that parents were educated on this, so that instead of taking your teen and putting them on birth control for these symptoms like heavy painful periods and acne and such, that they were those symptoms were addressed, those hormonal imbalances were addressed then, and that way they didn't have to utilize the birth control, or if they do go on birth control at some point for contraceptive purposes, that the symptoms have already been addressed. So when they come off birth control, they're not represented with all of these symptoms again. Retinoids are a common topical treatment that are used. You might have heard of retinol before, and they work by increasing cell turnover. And when cells turn over faster, it essentially exfoliates the skin and minimizes the amount of pores that are clogged and bacteria that is in there. And when the pores are less clogged and there's less bacteria building up, then there's less breakouts that happen. So you might have been put on a retinoid before because of this. Retinol is actually what's naturally found in vitamin A in foods. So there's a couple of different sources of vitamin A. There's beta carotene, which is what's in vegetables that we convert about a small percentage. Some people it's as low as 2 to 3% over to retinol. But you can also eat retinol. The best source of it is beef liver. And you can also get it from things like cod liver oil. You can get some from eggs, like egg yolks, especially if they're grass-fed, because when the animal eats the grass, they're able to convert this over to retinol for us. But these retinols are naturally found in food and then synthetically made in skincare products and such. But we can actually incorporate a lot of retinol, and most people are deficient in vitamin A, are deficient in retinol because there's such poor conversion over to retinol. And it's one of the reasons why, if you follow me on Instagram, you know I'm a huge fan of beef liver. I eat it quite a bit, not only because of the skin benefits, but also benefits for overall sex hormone production. Vitamin A is really like a precursor hormone to our sex hormones. It's incredible for helping make adequate testosterone and estrogen and all these other really important hormones. It's important for our eyes, our skin, so many things. So a lot of people get worried about eating those foods and eating too much vitamin A, but rest assured that the research that's been done on vitamin A toxicity has been done in synthetic vitamin A, not in natural food form retinol. So they're very different, and they're two different things. And nature has a way of protecting us from ingesting too much of substances. That's why in nature, things always exist in unison. So when you eat beef liver, you don't just get retinol, you also get iron and copper and B vitamins and such. And when things are synergistic, it helps prevent that excess accumulation from happening. And when there's something our body can naturally recognize, there's less worry about excess occurring. So not something to worry about. If you're worried about the taste of it, then you can do the desiccated beef liver. Those are capsules that you can purchase. But really, it's not that bad. It just takes a little bit of getting used to and knowing how to cook it properly. There's brands that sell it ground, which is how I recommend consuming it. I personally don't consume it as a steak. I only consume it ground. But really, you can get creative here with how you incorporate it. But if you want to get that internal retinol support that retinoids provide, that would be your best option. So as I mentioned with spironolactone and birth control, going back to them, these two work on those androgens. So they work on lowering androgens, and with birth control, also increasing sex hormone binding globulin. And as I mentioned, insulin resistance, which is very common. It's 70% of women with PCOS have insulin resistance, which so many women in reproductive years have PCOS. Insulin resistance is brewing for 8 to 10 years in the background before someone gets diagnosed with diabetes. I can't tell you how often we see insulin resistance, even in individuals that are eating a very healthy diet. I've even been insulin resistant at one point in my life when I was exercising and eating a very healthy diet as well, because there's a lot of other factors that influence insulin resistance. As I mentioned, it's not just the amount of carbohydrate you're eating. It's why are these cells not sensitized to this hormone? So what happens is that this insulin resistance causes that hyperinsulinemia, which means that there's a lot of insulin being produced. And when this happens, there's an increase in the production of a stimulation hormone from our brain called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And when LH is high, this increases the amount of androgens that are secreted from the ovaries. So a lot of women, for example, generally have high levels of LH. A lot of women with PCOS have high levels of LH. They have a high LH to FSH ratio. LH is generally in the highest amount around ovulation, right before ovulation, because LH is what happens prior to the ability to ovulate. So if we've got really high LH levels, it's going to increase the amount of testosterone that's produced at that point in the cycle, and it's going to generally suppress the amount of progesterone that can be made. And this is why a lot of women that have hormonal acne, they notice a trend to when they have it. And generally women will notice it at the middle point of your cycle. So around ovulation, usually around day 14 to 17, if you're ovulating, and generally again, right before you start your period. They're two completely different reasons as to why you're experiencing them at those point in time. So sometimes knowing when you're experiencing the acne can help us pinpoint how to treat it really. So if you're experiencing the middle point, it could be a situation of really elevated androgens and high LH levels. If you're experiencing right before you start your period, I generally think more so liver clearance issues. Your body's not clearing those hormones efficiently because in that second half of the cycle, right before you start your period, you've had a buildup of a ton of hormones happening. You've had a lot of estrogen, a lot of progesterone, a lot of testosterone in the system, and your body needs to get rid of all of that as you're going to start your period. And if your liver isn't clearing these hormones out efficiently, then you're going to see issues present with breakouts during that time period. And generally, you'll also experience like PMS symptoms and other things that are tied back to the liver as well. So that's one way to kind of understand more cyclical acne. Is something called face mapping. You've probably heard of before, which looks at where the acne is located on your face to kind of identify where the acne is coming from. I do find that that does generally match up, not always, but it can be very helpful. I would say in 70 to 80% of cases, it does match up. makeup. Generally, chin tends to be more hormonal. I find that the cheeks and the forehead tend to be more gut related. And then generally people that have a mix of all of it have back acne, body acne. It tends to be a mix of all of these situations as well. There's also something that is called fungal acne that I don't think is talked about enough. When I had acne, that was actually what I had. And I find that to be something that's mistreated a lot, because with fungal acne, it has to be treated very differently. A lot of these like antibiotics that most women are started on as the first line of defense for acne aren't going to work because it's fungal in nature. They might work a little bit, but they're not going to clear it long term. And generally, if it's fungal, you're going to notice that there's less whiteheads, and there's more kind of clusters of breakouts that are happening. They're much smaller. They're not as like inflamed and cystic looking as hormonal acne is. And fungal acne generally goes back to there's a fungal overgrowth in the body. So a lot of times women that experience fungal acne also have issues like eczema, dandruff, recurrent yeast infections, smelly breath, because those are also symptoms of fungal overgrowth. So I know that's not part of the whole like different medication piece of things, but I think it's important to note because a lot of women are put on the wrong medication and their skin isn't clear because it's actually a different type of sourcing. Okay, now let's go to Accutane. So the active ingredient in Accutane is called isotretinoin, and this works by blocking the function of your sebaceous gland in the skin. And it also blocks something that's called keratinization, which is a process of your skin cells maturating. So essentially is blocking the ability for all this growth of skin cells to happen. And both of these processes, both the sebum formation and the cell growth of the skin, can both lead to acne. And you probably have heard that Accutane is very strong, and it generally is advised that when you are on it, you are also on birth control because it's not safe to reproduce while you are on Accutane. And that just goes to show you the magnitude of how it impacts our hormones and our internal health. And I think it's something that is used for a lot of women because they're at a point of frustration. But I would really encourage you that if this is where you are, to really, really do some digging as to what's going on hormonally, what's going on in the gut, because I could bet you that there's so much that can be cleaned up in there that would decrease your need to be able to utilize something as strong and as potentially impactful to your hormone function as Accutane. Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk about just some of the hormonal things that impact our skin, and then just providing a little bit more into some of the nutritional and lifestyle things that we can do to support our skin and support some of these different ways that these medications are working on our skin. So I think there's a lot of misconception that high estrogen is the cause of acne, that if you're estrogen dominant, this is why you're having breakouts. But estrogen is actually incredible for our skin. Estrogen is clearing to our skin because it helps to support the moisture balance of our skin. It also helps decrease the production of sebum, which is this oily like substance that clogs our pores and causes breakouts. It also helps with preventing things like wrinkles. It can be incredible for your overall skin integrity. It's not so much estrogen that's the problem. It's how your body is getting that estrogen out of the system. So you make estrogen, and then that estrogen has to bind to the receptors all over the body of where estrogen is utilized. You have estrogen receptors in your skin, in your brain, in your ovaries, so on and so forth. And then once that estrogen binds the receptors, then it goes through 3 different phases of metabolism in our liver. And phase 1 and phase 2 predominantly happen in the liver, and they require a significant load of different enzymes and nutrients like amino acids and antioxidants and things to be able to get that estrogen through each of those steps safely. And there's cytochromes and different genetic factors that can influence this. Like if you have MTHFR or COMT key. These are genetic polymorphisms that can influence how efficiently you're able to do this. This can also get impacted by if the liver's also doing a lot of work at clearing other things. Maybe you are also exposed to a lot of endocrine disruptors on a day-to-day basis. Your liver's clearing mold, it's clearing heavy metals, it's doing a lot of work in other areas. Then it's going to be harder for you to clear this estrogen because you've got a lot of stuff all going down that same funnel. All of it goes through that same system. And then in phase 3, which is really the final stage of estrogen clearance, estrogen comes out our gut and through our stool. And as it makes its way all the way through our gut down to our colon, there's something there that's an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. And this beta-glucuronidase, essentially what happens is that estrogen gets packaged up. Think of it, it's like in a box and it has a lid on it. And when it makes its way all the way to the end, that if that beta-glucuronidase is elevated, which can be elevated because of different bacteria that are in our gut that we don't want there, that lid that has all of that estrogen that was getting packaged up to be safely removed gets popped off of the box, and that estrogen comes out of the box and can then get reabsorbed and go back into recirculation. I know it's crazy. There's this many steps involved in this process, right? But that's why it's so much more complicated than just, are we making too much estrogen, right? There's so many other steps that are involved here. And that's why being able to see how your body's metabolizing estrogen, which we can look at through the urine, through something like a Dutch test, and then also what that end stage looks like in the gut through looking at your poop and something like a GI map, is really helpful for understanding the bigger picture of what's going on with that estrogen. Now, we talked about testosterone and how really the elevations, the high testosterone, and how that testosterone is metabolizing are the most problematic. We haven't touched too much on progesterone, but progesterone is also a really important piece to our skin. And progesterone tends to be a little bit more acne forming. So, of course, estrogen and progesterone always balance one another. So, we want to have these hormones in the right quantities of one another. But this is another reason why you might notice more skin troubles in the second half of your cycle, because this is also when progesterone is in much higher quantities. It's not really made very much at all in the first half of the cycle until you ovulate. Okay. And then you've also got non-sex hormones. You have those adrenal hormones. So remember, there's all those androgens that are made from the adrenals, but then you also make corticosteroids like cortisol. And cortisol also tends to be very acne forming because it increases sebum production. So it's going to increase the amount of that oil that's under the skin. It's also, when it comes to acne, it's kind of like this perfect storm of there's a lot of oil that's under the pore. Skin cells aren't turning over quick enough. So they're all that dead skin cells, this dead skin is building up. There's imbalance of the microbiome on the skin. These bacteria are all imbalanced. And when we look at things like cortisol, cortisol increases that sebum production, but it also decreases how quickly skin cells are turning over. Because if you think about it, when your body's in fight or flight mode, it's not so focused on things like turning over skin cells. It's more so focused on survival and running from the tiger that caused the cortisol to elevate in the first place. So that really helps you understand how these hormones and these different mechanisms are working. There's not really any pharmaceuticals out there that I know are really driving down cortisol, but the spironolactone, like we talked about, it does decrease the amount of those androgens that come from the adrenal glands. So if your adrenals are more of the issue behind your acne, you're probably going to respond better to the spironolactone because of that. However, there are a lot of ways that we can support cortisol. Cortisol doesn't just elevate for no reason. At the most basic form, we can really focus on regulating our nervous system throughout the day. We talk about the nervous system a lot on my podcast, but this can look like the type of exercise that you're doing, the amount that you're sleeping, the amount of caffeine you're drinking and when you're drinking it, how your meals look and how often you're eating. If you're getting into a low blood sugar state, that's definitely a situation of high cortisol levels. If we're under eating, that also will increase cortisol levels. Then we can also utilize support tools, things like deep breathing techniques to help with getting into that parasympathetic state. We can utilize herbs, especially adaptogenic herbs, to be able to help with lowering and helping our body really cope with that cortisol more efficiently. So those are some things that we can start with. Sometimes when it comes to cortisol, it's a deeper situation of we have to ask, why is the body still releasing so much cortisol? Sometimes it can be that there is imbalance in the gut, for example, that's putting a lot of stress on our adrenals. Sometimes it can be trauma that may need to be something that you're working through with a therapist or with some type of mental health professional at the same time to be able to help with some of that, those unresolved emotions that are causing your body to be in a chronic state of fight or flight. There's something that's called limbic system rewiring that can be a really helpful resource for individuals that have more of this chronic trauma that's driving this chronic cortisol response. So high cortisol doesn't tend to be the only cause of acne. I don't know that I've ever seen just high cortisol be what's causing someone's acne. But you've probably noticed before that your acne gets worse when you're stressed, right? And that when your body's stressed, that you typically tend to have more breakouts and more issues with your skin. So it absolutely plays a role in your overall skin function. And unfortunately, there's no clear-cut answer when it comes to how to fix your cortisol levels. It goes back to we have to look at all these different angles of where that stress bucket is getting overfilled. Remember that stress can come from so many different angles. It can be emotional, it can be physical from exercise, it can be imbalances in the body, it can be nutritional stress. All of these things can cause depletions of the systems that we need to be able to really create a robust stress response. And I think it's important with cortisol too that we think about is I'm not a big fan of just telling people that you need to lower your stress. Like I've never personally I've never enjoyed when people have told me that, because sometimes these are things that are really out of our control and we're just doing our best every day. But I'd more so start with asking yourself, what are the things that you can adjust? And then asking yourself too, if I can't change these things, can I change my response to them? I think that's so big because there may be things that we can say that, yeah, I'm working myself up too much about this, or there's some things that I can do to be able to help with, with reducing stress. Like say that you're under financial stress. Could it be like, could you reduce some of that financial stress by selling some things or like downgrading your life? Like these are just things to think about as some of the stress things that you could reduce that, the perception of it through making some very small adjustments. So now kind of wrapping up with some of these nutritional approaches. So we talked about some of the ways these different pharmaceuticals work and the importance of really supporting that androgen production. And then we can do that through improving that insulin sensitivity by improving our blood sugar, improving our mitochondrial function, and how our cells are utilizing, are responding to that hormone insulin. We also talked about the importance of that highly absorbable vitamin A as retinol. Remember, not the beta carotene form, but that retinol form to be able to help with skin clearing. We talked about the role of the gut microbiome and how estrogen goes through the gut at that end stage, and that we may need some support in this area to be able to shift our microbiome, and to be able to lower that beta glucuronidase enzyme and really open up how our body is detoxifying. And that there's several ways that we can do that through getting some more information as to where is the bottleneck happening within our liver and within our gut, and then utilizing specific nutrients that open up those processes that support how things are moving through the liver, because all of this is driven through nutrients and enzymes that we consume in our diet. Maybe it's through avoiding certain things that are putting too much load on our liver. And maybe it's through also utilizing specific herbal support that's going to help to be able to get rid of some of this overgrowth of these bacteria that are in our microbiome as well. The last thing is really supporting digestion. This isn't something we talked about too much, but we talked about cortisol. And one of the ways that elevations of cortisol affect us is that they decrease the amount of digestive enzymes and stomach acid that are released. And one of the things that we commonly see with acne, and there's literature to support this, is low hydrochloric acid, which is low stomach acid, low digestive enzymes, and low amounts of bile acid secretion. These are all juices that are made in different areas of our body that all go into breaking down and absorbing the nutrients from food that we eat. Digestive enzymes help with protein and carb breakdown. Bile helps with fat breakdown. betaine, which is stomach acid, helps primarily with protein breakdown. So if we're not breaking these proteins and fats and carbs down when we eat them, then they're not getting absorbed properly, and they're going to cause more issues with the sebum buildup and imbalances in our microbiome. So we can support these through just first and foremost through eating the right foods that help stimulate the bitter receptors in our mouth that help us secrete the right amounts of these. When we eat bitter foods, things like arugula and beets and lemon peel and dandelion, they're really great for helping to be able to stimulate the secretion of these naturally. And then if we do testing and we see that you need additional support, then that's where we can actually use targeted amounts of enzymes and acid and bile to be able to support your body while these levels are low, until we're able to make some of these corrections and how your body's releasing these juices to be able to then get you to a place where you no longer need that support. So I hope this episode was informative for anyone that is struggling with acne, has anyone that they love struggling with it. I know firsthand how incredibly frustrating skin issues are. I've dealt with them myself, and it really feels like you are just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks sometimes. And it can just be so frustrating when you're trying to understand what's the best next step to take when you're feeling so incredibly frustrated with your skin. But I want to reassure you that there is hope, that there is so much that you can do, that there is always a root cause to these weird symptoms that we experience. We just have to gather the right information, have the right plan of attack to be able to support our body in healing and rebalancing. And we're here for you if you need support in being able to do so. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you back next week for another episode.